The Thornwell garrison was not a fortress in the way the word implied protection. It was a closed system, a sealed biome of gray ascomite stone and reinforced ice glass, grown 200 meters down into the frozen mantle of a world that had no name, only a registry number. And the registry number was the kind of detail the High Sovereignty preferred, because a number cannot be loved, and a number cannot become a banner. The garrison existed to convert living things into instruments of state. It took the children of conquered planets, the orphans of the annexation wars, the surplus heirs of subjugated houses, and it pressed them through 11 cycles of conditioning until what came out the far side could hold a position, follow a chain of command, and feel nothing that the chain of command had not authorized. The corridors were kept at a precise 4 degrees above freezing, because cold sharpens compliance, and the lighting was a flat blue-white that cast no warm shadow anywhere, on purpose, so that no corner of the place could ever feel like a home. Into this system, by an administrative decision logged under a routine personnel exchange treaty and signed by people who never expected to be asked about it, came a single human. His designation in the intake ledger read, Technical Auxiliary, Unrated, Species Terran, Origin Suborbital Salvage Cooperative. He was 34 standard years old, of ordinary height, with dark hair already going gray at the temples, and hands that had been broken and reset enough times that they no longer closed completely flat. He was not a soldier. He had never held a rank. He had spent his entire working life inside the gutted hulls of derelict ships in the salvage yards that orbited a dying star, prying value out of wreckage in vacuum and dark. And the Sovereignty had requisitioned him the way it requisitioned a length of cable. As a fungible part to fill a maintenance gap, the garrison's own caste system had left open. The officers who processed him did not look at him twice. He was not a threat. He was a tool that breathed. That assessment was correct in every particular except the one that mattered, and it would take the garrison the better part of a season to discover which particular that was. His name was Aldous Rika, and on his first morning inside Thornwell he did the thing that would, eventually, unmake the entire structure around him, though no one watching understood it as anything more than a man wiping frost off a railing. The maintenance spine of the garrison ran below the training tiers, a cathedral of pipework and recycled air ducting that the cadets never saw and the officers never thought about. And it was here that Raikou was sent, alone, with a tool roll and a directive to keep the systems running and otherwise remain invisible. He read the systems the way he read a dead ship. He listened to them. The recyclers had a harmonic in them, a low grinding shudder at the 4th cycle of every rotation, and within an hour he had traced it to a fatigue crack in a coupling that the garrison's own diagnostic protocols had flagged as nominal for 3 years. He repaired it without filing a report, because filing a report would have meant explaining how he knew, and he had learned a long time ago that the surest way to survive in a place that did not want you was to be useful in ways no one could quite account for. The garrison's apex was not a person, but a presence, and her name was spoken inside Thornwell only in the 3rd person, never to her face, because almost no one inside Thornwell ever saw her face. She was the matriarch sovereign Vial Theronix, and the dominion she held was not metaphor and not exaggeration. 41 inhabited systems answered to her directly. Her fleet had broken 3 civilizations that historians had once called unbreakable, and she had done it not through superior force, which she had, but through a faculty her species possessed and others did not. An instinct for the precise pressure point of any structure, biological or political, or material. The single load-bearing element whose removal collapses the whole. Her people were the Sithari, tall and luminous, their skin a pale silvered blue, threaded with bioluminescent channels that pulsed in time with their pulse, their eyes large and dark and capable of reading the microtremor of a lie in a throat from across a room. They did not rule through cruelty. Cruelty was inefficient. They ruled through the certainty, instilled in every subject across 41 systems, that resistance was not merely doomed but illegible, that the matriarch saw the weak seam in everything and everyone, and that she would find yours. She had built a galaxy on fear of being known too well. It was a very stable structure. It had exactly one flaw, and the flaw was 8 years old. The flaw's name was Nyala, and she was the matriarch's daughter, and she was, by the rigid standards of her people, defective. The Sithari measured a child's worth by the symmetry of her bioluminescent channels and the steadiness of her glow, and Nyala's glow flickered. It guttered when she was frightened and flared when she was delighted and refused, no matter how many correction protocols were applied, to settle into the smooth, controlled luminance that marked a Sithari fit to inherit. She had been sent to Thornwell, not as a cadet, because she was far too young, but as a ward, kept in a guarded residential tier where the conditioning specialists could study her irregularity and attempt, cycle after cycle, to correct it. The official position was that the matriarch's heir was receiving specialized developmental care. The actual position, understood by everyone with the sense to keep it unspoken, was that the most powerful being in the galaxy had a daughter she could not fix, and had placed her somewhere distant enough that the failure would not be witnessed. Nyala wandered the upper tiers when her keeper's attention lapsed, which was often because they found her exhausting and her irregularity unsettling, and she had a habit of slipping through maintenance hatches the conditioning specialists did not know existed. This was how, on a morning 40 days into Raiki's posting, an 8-year-old heir to 41 systems came down a ladder into the maintenance spine and found a human kneeling on the cold floor, splicing a power conduit by hand. She did not announce herself because announcing herself was a thing she had been punished for. She watched. Raiki knew she was there within the first 3 seconds, the way he knew everything in a space he was working in, but he did not turn, and he did not stop, because turning and stopping is how you frighten a thing that is deciding whether to trust you. He finished the splice. He tested it. The conduit hummed clean. Only then did he sit back on his heels and look at her, and what he said was not a greeting and not a question about who she was or whether she was allowed to be there. He said, in the flat, practical tone of a man noting a fact, that her left hand was cold and that she should keep it in her sleeve because the spine ran colder than the tears and small bodies lose heat from the extremities first. Then he went back to his tools. For Nyala, who had spent 8 years being measured, corrected, studied, and managed, the experience of being noticed for something other than her flaw was so foreign that she did not have a behavioral protocol for it. She sat down on a crate 3 meters away and stayed for 2 hours, and Raiki let her, and neither of them spoke again that day. What the conditioning specialists would later fail to understand in their reconstruction of events was that nothing dramatic occurred between the human and the child. There was no recruitment, no whispered alliance, no exchange of secrets. There was only the slow accretion of small ordinary acts performed in a place where small ordinary acts had been engineered out of existence. Reiki kept a thermal flask of a bitter root infusion. He brewed himself from supplies he requisitioned and traded for, and when Nyla came down to the spine, which she did most mornings now, he poured a measure into the flask's cap and set it on the crate beside her without comment, and she drank it. And the warmth of it in her hands did something to her glow that the correction protocols had never managed, which was to steady it. He showed her how a coupling fit together and let her tighten it herself. He did not praise her when she did it correctly, because praise is a kind of pressure, and she had drowned in pressure her whole life, and the absence of it was the first thing that had ever let her breathe. The Sithari ruled by finding the weak seam in everyone. The human had found the daughter's weak seam, which was that no one had ever simply let her exist beside them, and instead of pressing on it, he had filled it. The garrison's commandant was a Sithari officer named Corvus Hald, and he was the kind of dangerous that the institution was specifically designed to produce and reward. He was not the matriarch's equal, and he knew it, which was the engine of everything he did. His own channels glowed with the flawless controlled luminance that marked a high-status Sithari, and he had risen through Thornwell's hierarchy by understanding before anyone else that the garrison was not only a conditioning facility, but a sorting mechanism, a place where the surplus airs of 41 systems passed through his hands, and that a man positioned at the throat of such a flow could divert a great deal that no one would ever miss. The annexation wars had produced more orphaned heirs than the registries could track. Hald had spent 11 years adjusting those registries. Children logged as deceased in the conditioning attrition reports, which carried an accepted and unexamined casualty rate, were not always deceased. Some were sold quietly, through a brokerage of intermediaries, to the private holdings of magnates across the rimward systems who valued a trained and broken Sithari instrument and asked no questions about provenance. The attrition rate was the perfect cover. No one investigates a number that everyone already expects to be high. Hald had grown wealthy in ways that did not appear in any ledger, and he had grown comfortable. And comfort is the thing that eventually makes a careful man careless. He had not expected the matriarch's daughter. The ward placement had been imposed on him from above, a complication he resented, because a child of that significance meant periodic attention from the sovereign's own auditors, and attention was the one thing his arrangement could not survive. He managed the risk the way he managed everything, by controlling the flow of information, ensuring that the auditors saw a model facility and a well-cared-for heir, and nothing of the maintenance spine or the adjusted registries or the human auxiliary who had begun without authorization to occupy the child's mornings. When that last fact reached him, through a keeper's offhand complaint that the ward was spending her time below with the Terran tool, Hald did not act on it immediately, because Hald never acted immediately. He observed. And what he observed over a span of days through the spine's own monitoring feeds was a problem that was worse than an irregularity. The child's glow was steadying. The defect the entire galaxy knew about, the flaw that justified her exile to his facility, was correcting itself. And it was correcting itself in the presence of a human he could not account for and had not approved. If the heir went home stable, the auditors would ask what had changed. And if they looked hard enough at what had changed, they would look at his facility, and they would not stop at the human. Hald made a decision, and because he was a careful man, he made it look like generosity. There was a training exercise scheduled for the deep biome, the live ecology that the garrison maintained 6 tiers down, a managed wilderness of engineered flora kept for the cadets' survival conditioning. It was lethal by design. The flora was real, and the hazards were real. And the casualty rate among cadets was the kind of number that fed the attrition reports Hald had spent a career exploiting. He arranged through a routine reassignment order for the human auxiliary to be sent into the deep biome to repair an environmental regulator that had conveniently begun to fail. He arranged for the regulator's failure himself through an intermediary who did not know what he was enabling, and he arranged for the deep biome's containment systems to suffer a cascade fault during the human's repair window, a fault that would release the managed ecology from its dormancy cycle and turn the engineered wilderness into exactly what it had been built to be, a thing that killed. It would read in the report as a tragic equipment failure, compounded by an unrated auxiliary working beyond his competence. The attrition rate would absorb it, and the child's anomalous influence would absorb with it. The deep biome was the most beautiful place in Thornwell, and the most patient killer. It rose around Reiki as the lift descended, a cavern lit by the flora's own faint phosphorescence, ranks of crystalline growths like frozen fountains, fronded canopies of a deep wine-dark blue that swayed in air currents there was no wind to explain, and a floor of pale moss that compressed underfoot with a sound like held breath. He had been briefed on none of it, honestly. He had been told to repair a regulator. He carried his tool roll and a hand lamp and the flat alertness of a man who had spent his life in places that wanted him dead. And that alertness was the first thing Hold's plan had failed to account for, because a salvage diver in a derelict reactor learns to distrust a room before he understands why. Rika distrusted this room. The regulator was where the order said it would be, and it was failing the way the order said it was, but the failure was wrong. The fatigue pattern on the housing did not match a regulator that had degraded over time. It matched a regulator that had been opened, adjusted, and closed again recently by someone who wanted it to fail on a schedule. He did not yet know what the schedule was for. He started the repair anyway because the repair was real regardless of why he was there, and he was 3 minutes into it when the cavern's light changed. The phosphorescence brightened, the wine-dark canopies stopped swaying in their currentless drift and turned, all of them, the broad fronds rotating to orient on the heat and motion at the cavern's center, which was him. The pale moss underfoot tightened. Somewhere in the crystalline growths a tone began, a single sustained note climbing slowly in pitch, and Rika understood with the cold clarity that had kept him alive for 34 years that the room had just woken up and decided he was food. He did not run because he did not yet know which direction was not also a mouth. He closed the regulator housing, sealed his tool roll, and began with the unhurried economy of a man doing inventory in a burning building to read the ecology that was reading him. The fronds tracked heat. The crystalline growths produced the rising tone, and the tone was doing something to his inner ear, a pressure, a wrongness, and he recognized it for what it was because he had felt it once before in a salvage hull near a ruptured resonance core. The growths were tuning to a frequency that would, when it peaked, liquefy the soft tissue of anything in range. He had perhaps 4 minutes. The lift was dead, its power rerouted. And 40 meters away, crouched in the entrance of a maintenance hatch she was never supposed to have followed him through, was Nyala. She had come down because he had not come up. That was the whole of her reasoning, the simple logic of an 8-year-old who had found the one person in her life who set warmth on a crate beside her and asked nothing, and who had noticed his absence the way she had never been permitted to notice anyone's. She should not have been able to reach the deep biome. She had reached it through the unmapped maintenance hatches she alone seemed to know. The same gift for finding the unwatched seam that her mother possessed and had been unable to recognize in her flickering, defective daughter. Now, she crouched at the cavern's edge, her glow guttering wildly with fear. And the guttering was a beacon, because the fronds tracked not only heat, but the electromagnetic flutter of distress, and they were already beginning to turn toward the small, bright, frightened thing at the hatch. Reiki saw the whole shape of it at once, the rising tone, the 4 minutes, the child whose terror was painting her as the next target, and the understanding, arriving cold and certain, that the equipment failure he had been sent to repair was not an equipment failure at all, that someone had built this room to kill him and had not cared that a child might wander into it, or had cared and counted on it. What he did next, he did in the registers of action and not of thought. And an observer watching the feed would have seen only a series of unremarkable physical movements that added up to something the garrison's entire trained cadre could not have produced. He did not go to the child first, because going to the child first would have brought his own heat signature toward her and merged them into a single, larger target. Instead, he moved away from her, deliberately, toward the largest cluster of crystalline growths, and he began to work. He pulled from his tool roll a coil of conductive splicing wire, the same wire he had used on the conduit the morning Nyala first watched him. And he understood the growths the way he understood any resonant system, which was that a thing tuned to a frequency can be detuned by a louder, dirtier frequency introduced at the right node. He found the node. It was the smallest growth in the cluster, the runt, the one a trained eye would have dismissed, and it was the load-bearing element, the seam, the wrong pixel in the perfect lethal system. He wrapped the wire around it. He stripped the regulator's own power feed, the feed he had just repaired, and he fed raw, unconditioned current into the runt growth. And the clean rising tone the cavern had been building toward shattered into a grinding, broken discord that propagated through the entire crystalline network and collapsed it, every growth in the cavern losing its tuning at once, the killing frequency dissolving into noise. He had bought minutes. He had not bought safety. The fronds still tracked heat. The moss still tightened, and the child was still 40 meters away and bright with terror. The detuning bought him the minutes, but it also taught the room something, because the crystalline network was not the only system in the cavern that learned. The fronds had been tracking 2 heat signatures, the large one at the center and the small, bright, frightened one at the hatch. And with the killing tone broken, they did what an organism does when its primary weapon fails, which was reprioritize. They oriented, the entire wine-dark canopy turning as one on the smaller and weaker target, because a frightened thing 40 meters away that could not detune anything was simpler prey than the human who had just shattered their tuning. Rika read the turn before it finished. He had perhaps 90 seconds now, not 4 minutes, and the lift was still dead, and the hatch the child had come through was behind her, and the moss between him and her had begun to tighten in slow contractile ripples that he understood with the cold clarity of a man who had once watched a salvage hull's gravity plating fail in sequence were the room learning to herd. He crossed to her now, and he did not run even now, because the fronds responded to acceleration, and he moved with the smooth, unhurried gait of a man walking across a familiar yard, the moss compressing under each deliberate step with its sound of held breath. And he reached her and he knelt, putting himself between Nyala and the cavern, and he did the only thing that had ever steadied her. He took the thermal flask from his belt, the bitter root infusion still warm in it, and he poured a measure into the cap and put it in her shaking hands and told her, in the flat, practical voice he had used the first morning, that her left hand was cold. She drank. The familiarity of it, the impossible, ordinary familiarity of the warm cap in the killing room, reached past her terror to the one circuit in her that had learned to associate this human with safety, and her guttering glow steadied. It steadied, and as it steadied, it dimmed. The wild electromagnetic flutter that the fronds had been tracking smoothing into a low, even luminance, and the canopies, deprived of the distress signal, lost her. Reiki had not calmed the child to comfort her. He had calmed the child because a calm child was invisible to a room that hunted fear, and he had known that, and he had also simply wanted her not to be afraid, and both of those things were true at once, and neither canceled the other. They went out through the maintenance hatch she had come in by, the human and the air, moving through the unmapped capillaries of the garrison that only an 8-year-old defect and a salvage diver could read. And they came up into the cold blue corridors 3 tiers above the deep biome, and it was there, in the dead space between the ward tier and the maintenance spine, that Nyla did the thing the entire rest of the story would turn on. She stopped. She had carried something the whole way out, clutched in the hand that was not holding the flask cap, and Reiki had not seen it in the dark and the urgency. It was a circlet, a small, clumsy ring of the deep biome's wine-dark fronds, woven badly and coming apart at one seam, the kind of thing a child makes with her hands when no one is teaching her to do anything useful, the kind of thing the conditioning specialists would have confiscated as a developmental irregularity. She had been making it before she noticed he was gone. She had carried it through the killing room. Now she reached up because he was kneeling and she was small, and even kneeling he was nearly her height, and she set the ragged little crown of alien flowers on his graying human head. And she stepped back to look at it, and her glow flared, not with fear, with the unguarded delight that 8 years of correction protocols had failed to extinguish, and for the first time since the intake ledger had logged him as a tool that breathed, someone in Thornwell had crowned the human as something other than a part. He left it on. That was the whole of his response, and it was the correct one, because to remove it would have been to refuse the gift, and he did not refuse gifts from children who had nearly died. He stood up with the crown on his head and the flask on his belt, and the child's hand finding his, and he walked her back toward the ward tier with the absurd wilting circlet still crowning him. And that was the image the corridor monitor captured and logged and time-stamped, a human salvage auxiliary wearing a crown of deep biome flora made by the matriarch's daughter, and it was that image more than the collapsed crystalline network or the rerouted lift power or the falsified regulator fault that began the unmaking of Corvus Hald, because the auditors did review the feeds, and the matriarch reviewed what the auditors flagged, and what the matriarch saw when the flag reached her was not a security irregularity. It was her daughter's glow, steady, flared with joy, in a corridor of the facility where she had sent the child to be fixed, and where the child had not been fixed for 2 years. The glow had finally steadied, and it had steadied next to a human in a flower crown, and the most dangerous mind in 41 systems did what it had always done, which was look for the load-bearing element, the seam, the single thing on which the whole structure rested. She found it. It was not a thing she had a protocol for, and that, more than anything, was what made her come herself. She did not announce her arrival because the Sithari did not announce. And the first the garrison knew of the matriarch's sovereign vial, Thoronix's presence was the silence that preceded her, the way the cold blue corridors emptied as word ran ahead faster than she walked. Corvus Hald received her in the command tier with the flawless controlled luminance of a man who has rehearsed his innocence, and he presented his model facility and his well-managed ward and his regrettable equipment failure in the deep biome, which had, he was pleased to report, been survived by all parties through the quick action of the auxiliary staff. He had adjusted the regulator fault in the records already. He had absorbed it into the attrition rate. He had done everything a careful man does, and he had done it well, and it did not matter at all because the matriarch was not listening to his words. She was watching his channels. The Sithari read the micro-tremor of a lie in a throat from across a room, and across 41 systems no Sithari read it better than she did, and Corvus Hald, for 11 years, had been telling a great many lies to people who could not read him as well as she could. She let him talk. She let him walk her through the model facility tier by tier, the conditioning records, the ward's developmental logs, the regrettable equipment failure rendered in the careful exculpatory language of a man who has written many such reports. And as he talked, she watched the luminance in the fine channels at his throat and his jaw and the backs of his hands, the places where a Sithari's control was thinnest, and she cataloged each place the glow held a fraction too steady, because a true thing flickers naturally and a rehearsed thing does not. And the over-control of a practiced lie is as legible to a trained eye as a stammer. He told her the attrition rate was within accepted parameters. His channels held too still. He told her the auxiliary staff had acted with commendable initiative. Too still. He told her the air was thriving under his facility's specialized care, and at the word thriving, the channels at his jaw smoothed into a flawlessness so complete that it was, to the matriarch, a confession, because no one's control is perfect over a truth, only over a lie they have told so many times it has worn a groove. She asked to see her daughter. She was brought to the ward tier, and Niala, who had been told the matriarch was coming, and had spent 8 years learning to gutter with terror at exactly this prospect, did something her keepers had never witnessed. Her glow held steady. She stood in front of the being who ruled the galaxy, and her luminance did not flicker, because the steadiness the human had built in her over 40 mornings of warmth on a crate did not switch off in her mother's presence, and the matriarch saw that too. And the seeing of it did something to the most controlled face in the Dominion that the surveillance feed, reviewed later, could not quite resolve. Then, Niala, because she was 8 and because the protocols had failed gloriously to make her anything other than herself, told her mother about the room that woke up, and the tone that climbed, and the man who walked slowly when she wanted to run, and who put warmth in her cold hands and who let her crown him. She did not understand that she was filing a report. She thought she was telling her mother about her friend. But the matriarch heard the report inside the telling. The regulator that failed on a schedule, the lift power that rerouted, the killing room that activated during a repair window, and she set it against the lies in Corvus Hald's channels. And the load-bearing element of his 11-year arrangement came clear to her the way the seam of any structure always came clear to her, which was completely and at once. She had the human brought to her. Reiki came up from the spine in his work clothes with grease on his incomplete hands, and he was not afraid, and his lack of fear was the second thing that day to interest the matriarch, because everyone was afraid of her. It was the foundation she had built a galaxy upon, and the human stood in front of her with the same flat practical alertness he brought to a dead reactor and waited to find out what she wanted. She did not thank him, because gratitude was a pressure, and she sensed, without understanding why, that pressure was the wrong tool for this man. She asked him a single question. She asked him why he had to tune the crystalline network before he had retrieved the child, why he had spent his first and most precious minute on the room and not on her daughter. And Reiki answered the way he answered everything, which was plainly. He said that a frightened child is a beacon, and a calm child is invisible, and that he could not calm her until he had bought the time to reach her, and that the room had to be broken first, or there would have been no child left to calm. He said it the way he would have explained the firing order of a salvage cutter. And the matriarch, who had broken 3 civilizations by finding the seam, understood that she was looking at someone who found seams too, not in politics, not in biology, but in the brute physical logic of systems that wanted to kill the people in them, and who used that gift not to rule, but to repair. The reckoning with Corvus Hald did not happen in front of the child, and it did not happen in front of the human, because the matriarch understood the difference between justice and spectacle and had never in her life confused the two. It happened in the command tier, behind a sealed door, and what passed there was not recorded and did not need to be. The adjusted registries were unadjusted. The children logged as attrition who were not dead were found, system by system, over the slow, grinding months that followed, and the brokerage of intermediaries was rolled up one node at a time by an auditor corps that had been given, for the first time, a reason to look hard at a number everyone had agreed not to examine. Corvus Hald was not made an example of, because examples are spectacle, and he was instead made into nothing. His name removed from the registries he had spent a career corrupting, his holdings dissolved into the restitution of the children he had sold, his existence converted into the one thing a man who had built his identity on careful invisibility could least survive, which was a thorough and permanent accounting. The matriarch did not give a speech about it. She simply found the seam and removed it, and let the structure he had built collapse into the truth it had always been concealing. Thornwell did not become a kind place. The matriarch did not have the power to make a galaxy kind, and she did not pretend to. And the garrison continued to exist because 41 systems still produced orphans, and the orphans still needed somewhere to go. But the attrition rate, once it was a thing that was watched, began to fall, because most of what had inflated it had never been death at all. Reiki was not promoted because rank was a structure, and he had no use for it. But his designation in the ledger was quietly amended, and the amendment was the only acknowledgement he received and the only one he wanted. He went back down to the maintenance spine. The system still needed reading. The recyclers still developed harmonics, and the couplings still fatigued, and a man who could hear a fatigue crack 3 years before the diagnostics flagged it was worth more in the spine than he would ever have been in a uniform. And most mornings, when her keeper's attention lapsed, which it still did, an 8-year-old heir to 41 systems came down a ladder into the maintenance spine and sat on a crate 3 meters away. And a human poured a measure of bitter root infusion into the cap of a thermal flask and set it on the crate beside her without comment. And her glow, in the cold blue light of a place built to extinguish exactly that, held steady and even and warm. The matriarch came back. Not often, because 41 systems did not run themselves, but more than the affairs of state strictly required. And when she came, she did not summon the human to the command tier. She came down to the spine. She was too tall for the maintenance passages, and she folded herself into them anyway. The most powerful being in the galaxy crouched on a crate in a freezing cathedral of pipework, watching her daughter tighten a coupling under the unpraising eye of a salvage diver. And she said very little, because she had spent her whole life reading the tremor of lies in throats, and she had found, in the spine, a place where no one was lying, and the novelty of it held her there longer than she would ever have admitted. She watched the human pour the warm infusion into the cap. She watched her daughter's hands, steady now, fit the coupling true. She watched the way the human did not look up to check whether the matriarch was impressed, because the matriarch's opinion was simply not a variable in the physics of the repair, and that the sustained and total indifference to her power was a thing no one in 41 systems had ever offered her, and it was the most restful thing she had ever encountered. On the last morning of one such visit, as she unfolded herself from the crate to return to the work of holding a galaxy together, the matriarch paused at the foot of the ladder, and she looked back at the human, who had a wilting circlet of deep biome fronds, freshly made and freshly clumsy, set once again upon his graying head, because the child made him a new one most weeks now, and he wore each one until it fell apart. The matriarch had never worn a crown. Her people did not crown their rulers. A crown is a symbol, and the Sithari ruled through certainty, not symbol, and she had broken 3 civilizations bareheaded. She looked at the ridiculous wilting thing on the human's head, the badly woven gift of her defective daughter, who was not defective at all, but had only needed one person in the cold to set warmth on a crate beside her. And she did not smile, because the Sithari face did not smile, but the channels along her jaw, the controlled and flawless channels that had never once in her life flickered, brightened by a fraction she did not authorize and could not have prevented. A single, unguarded pulse of warmth in the being who ruled the galaxy, and then she climbed the ladder and was gone. Raike adjusted the crown, which had slipped. Niala tightened the next coupling. The recyclers hummed clean, and the warm cap sat steaming on the crate, and 3 meters of cold blue air separated the human and the child and held nothing hostile in it at all.